with the presentation that she did do. Okay, we're continuing. We're and so we asked Dorothy to come back again. And I want you to know that we do have copies of the book, Nuclear Option, in the Wham office. And if you call the Wham office, you can go over to the Wham office on 42nd and Cedar and pick up a copy of the book. You can make a donation of $20 or more if you would be able to do that. And if you can't get to the office, give the office a call. And if you are in the Twin Cities area, I'd be glad to deliver a book to you. That we can work that into our schedules. So I want to tell you, and perhaps you know this already, that Dorothy, in the very early years of Wham, was teaching on the faculty of the University of Minnesota Department of Social Work, along with her colleague Mary White, who was one of the Wham founders. And together they wrote a booklet called Empowerment of People for Peace, which was a guide for Wham people in becoming anti-nuclear and pro-justice activists, and a wonderful concept of organizing, really. Since Dorothy's retirement, she's been writing fiction, and especially mystery stories, including Nuclear Option. And one of the blurbs on the back of Dorothy's book sums it up in such a succinct way. And it's written by Beth Brunton, which is that some books entertain, some inform, some inspire. Nuclear Option does all three. So I want to introduce you to Dorothy Van Soest. If you have questions or comments while Dorothy is speaking, Sophia will pass those along to, is that right, Soph? That how can they contact you with their questions?
Yes, if they're watching from Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, they can comment on that stream and I'll forward it to Dorothy. Or if you are in the Zoom meeting, you can ask it yourself at the end if you'd like.
Good. Thank you so much. I'm going to mute myself, and Dorothy, please go ahead with your presentation about Nuclear Option.
Thank you. It is good to be back. What can I say? There were maybe 60 people at the first event. And so I have been nervous all day about whether this slideshow is going to work this time or not. And I'm glad that you're live streaming it, because people who came before who couldn't come back tonight can opt in to watch it later. So hopefully we'll get more people who will buy the book from Wham as well. I'm going to cut my video out while I'm doing the slide presentation and then come back in, because they say it works better that way. And I'd rather that you look at the slideshow and not me. So I want to start by talking. I want to start by talking about storytelling as a tool of change. I think we rely in movement work and peace work a lot on data and theoretical discourse to change people's hearts and minds, to mobilize them to get active for peace and justice work. And after decades of working in academia and doing academic research, I've come to believe that how we experience events in our world and how we see our role in relation to them is most profoundly affected by the personal connections we make through the stories we're exposed to and the stories we tell, which is why in retirement I turned to fiction writing, which is a whole new craft. So I want to approach this as not only a presentation about nuclear option, but about the power of story. And as an example of that. So to start, nuclear option is my fourth attempt at writing a novel. And when I tell people that it was just published several months ago, the first question they usually ask is, well, what is this one about? And then when I answer that question, they say, well, why did you write that? And if they're still with me after that, they may be curious enough to know, how did I go about doing it? How did I come up with story? How did I come up with characters? So I want to just in a blurb, I think I'm going to skip well, no, because this is live streamed, I won't skip the part about what is it about, because there may be new people who would be watching the live stream. So let me just quickly give you the elevator pitch about what nuclear option is about. It's a mystery suspense thriller wrapped around historical events during the nuclear disarmament movement in the 1980s and the current issues surrounding nuclear technology in today's volatile atmosphere. My sleuth, Sylvia Jensen's, her story unfolds in two periods of time. In 1984, she was in love with Norton, an atomic veteran and fellow peace activist. In 2019, at the age of 77 and with her activist days behind her, she's drawn back into the fight by the unexpected appearance of Norton's troubled son, Corey. To save his life and those of countless others, she and her old friend, investigative reporter J.B. Harrell, must unravel a decades-old mystery and face the truth of the nuclear age before it's too late. I read that because otherwise I go into great detail about what it's about, and that's my elevator pitch. So that's what it's about in a nutshell. So that leads to the second question. Why did I write that? First, a little background to put the why into context. I wrote Nuclear Option, like all my novels, as a way to explore deep, intricate, and universal issues of race, class, and power, and expose some truth about the human condition and how we are all impacted by the complex world in which we live. Each of my novels was inspired by and grew out of an experience that had particular significance in my life. The social issue in Just Mercy, which was my first attempt, was the death penalty, and it was inspired by my research about the lives of the 37 men who were executed by the state of Texas in 1997. The next one, At the Center, turned out to be a mystery, which was a surprise to me. It centers around issues related to Indian child welfare and racial identity development. And it grew out of my experiences as a social worker in the early 1970s on an American Indian reservation. My teaching experiences in Chicago and the South Bronx in the 1960s inspired Death Uncharted, with the social justice issue being the inequitable educational system and the impact of racism and corporate greed on reform efforts, with a focus on the conflict between public schools versus charter schools, Nuclear Option was inspired by my nuclear disarmament activism in the 1980s, which I did in Minnesota with all of you wonderful Wham folks. So why then did I decide to focus on the nuclear threat for my fourth novel? In a nutshell, I think it's because I am more frightened by the possibility of nuclear war now than I was in 1982. And I also feel more alone about that fear, with that fear, than I did then. I have questions about why that others who are concerned and have told me that they feel the same way are also asking. So I wrote it to kind of address some of the questions that I was asking, like, why does it seem that so few are alarmed at the threat of nuclear war today? Are we in denial and overwhelmed by the enormity of so many doomsday crises at once? And we all know, with the pandemic and with the climate change that we're experiencing, the heat today in Seattle and yesterday, it is overwhelming. Maybe we're confused by so much information ricocheting nonstop between cable news, social media, online forums, by more and more propaganda and confusion about the facts, especially in recent years, with national leaders promulgating their own lies, exaggerations, and misrepresentations that create public distrust, inaction, and destructive actions. Maybe it's because of a tendency to turn the problem over to the experts and put our trust in our advanced technology, from Star Wars to ground missile defense systems, that will save the planet from a nuclear destruction. Or maybe it's because we're taking on so many terrible problems in our world in our own separate silos. And that makes us unable to see how all our social justice demands, such as disarmament, demilitarization of the police, environmental justice, they're all inextricably connected with the efforts for nuclear abolition. And maybe we just don't know what to do when we're faced with as huge a threat as annihilation. We may fear that if we speak up, people will think we're crazy or overreacting, and will fall back on socialization that taught us not to rock the boat, not to be too weird or out of line. I think in reality, we are asking a very great deal of our citizens to confront the issues. My hope in writing Nuclear Option is that by telling a story with a character with whom people hopefully can empathize, a few more people will wake up from sleepwalking through the current nuclear landscape. I wrote it in the hope that it might contribute in some small way to inspire people to join our effort to realize the promise of the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that nuclear weapons will be eliminated from the face of this earth. To sum it up, why did I write Nuclear Option? Because putting words on paper is my way of taking up arms again. Action gives me hope. I just came from a writer's retreat that I've been going to every year for over a dozen years now. And for the first time, the leader, my editor, referred to me as a narrative activist. And Carol, I think that's what you are too. Those of us who write fiction and stories about activist issues, that's activism. So when I'm sitting in my office in the morning and I'm writing books such as Nuclear Option, and I think, oh, I should be out there doing activism, now I realize that I'm here doing activism. So that's the why I wrote Nuclear Option. So that leads me to how I wrote it, how I wrote Nuclear Option. Where did my ideas come from? What was my writing process like? And then I'll read a few excerpts just to give you a flavor of the book. I traced the beginnings of Nuclear Option all the way back to World War II, when from 1939 to 1945, it took 50 million lives and spread its devastation across the globe to desert sands, Arctic tundras, and Asian jungles. the war of the atomic bomb, and the searing ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that forced us to learn how to live in the nuclear age. I grew up during the Cold War, when the fear of nuclear holocaust terrorized us regularly with the duck and cover drills in school. I remember being in 6th grade, and this picture in particular reminds me of the drills we had. When the alarm would go off, we'd silently line up, go out in the hall, and take this kind of position. And I remember the teacher, when the drill was over, telling us that we should go home immediately, not stop anywhere, and just go home and stay there. And I remember walking home and looking up at the sky and thinking, if a bomb is going to drop on us, why did she send us out so it'll fall right on our heads? I was terrorized. And then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was in college in Chicago at the time. And for 3 days, I walked around once again, looking up at the sky. Waiting for the end of the world. I think that's when the seeds of nuclear option were planted deep inside me, but then they were submerged alongside the terror of that time and forgotten for decades until Wham was founded. And Wham, with the nuclear disarmament movement in the 1980s, brought my terror to the forefront again. By people like Dr. Helen Caldicott and Jonathan Schell, and Wham turned it into action. I joined Women Against Military Madness in Minneapolis at its inception, created, as Lucia said, an empowerment group, and then co-authored a book and helped others form empowerment groups. I stayed for a while at the Women's Peace Camp in Seneca Falls, New York. You were there, right, Carol? No, you weren't there. Okay. Some of the women who were there do appear in Nuclear Option. By the way, this is a picture of the Mother's Day March, when we would all drag our children and say on Mother's Day, the gift you're going to give us is you're going to go on a Mother's Day March with us. So if you look in the far left corner, the woman with the red shirt is me. And the woman holding the banner with the Wham t-shirt is Nancy Johnston, who I think has been involved for a very long time and continues to support Wham. Maybe you recognize some of the other people in the picture. I see Jean Quam to the right behind the banner, who is the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Minnesota. I got arrested several times for trespassing at the Honeywell Corporation. In the book, the Honeywell Corporation is the Nectarol Corporation. Thank you, Lucia, for helping me find a name for the corporation. And Marv Davidoff, who was the heart and soul of the Honeywell project, who Carol Masters wrote a book, You Can't Do That, which I drew on heavily and made notes of and have used as a resource in Nuclear Option. In Nuclear Option, Marv Davidoff's name is Martin Lind. But I tried to capture him as best I could. So after those were the why I wrote it, where it came from, where the seeds came from, and then Wham. After Wham, I went into academia and I started to do research and academic writing and teaching about these things. And Father David Smith and I did teach some courses together on peace and social justice. But then my fears were submerged once again until 2016, when I heard the President of the United States say, if we have nuclear weapons, why not use them? And the fear just popped right back up to the surface. And I knew that my next Sylvia Jensen mystery had to deal with the nuclear threat. So I knew my sleuth well, Sylvia Jensen, from my previous two mysteries, but since I was writing fiction, I couldn't just write about my experiences with the nuclear disarmament movement. I had to have a plot. And as I was grappling with that, Betty Garcia, who's here, and I were talking about this, and she reminded me that she had done extensive research, had conducted interviews with many atomic veterans. And I went, oh my goodness, atomic veterans. And I read her dissertation again, and we talked about it, and that was it. My plot started to, I was horrified by what I learned about atomic veterans. I was appalled to realize that despite my activism in the 1980s, I had heard nothing about them. I was horrified by our destruction of and betrayal of the people of the Marshall Islands, the secrecy to which the atomic veterans were sworn so that they couldn't talk about being exposed to ionized radiation, the conspiracy of silence that surrounded all of it. So that was it. That is where the plot came from. I came up with the character of Norton, who was an atomic veteran, and had Sylvia fall in love with him. And they went on trial together. And in his testimony, for those of you who remember, many of us went on trial during that time, the Honeywell Corporation protests in groups, in affinity groups. And so in Nuclear Option, there's an affinity group, and Norton and Sylvia are both in that same group. And they decide that Norton will give the testimony for everybody in the group. So I decided the conspiracy of silence is best captured by my reading a page of Norton's testimony from Nuclear Option. So this is Norton speaking to the jury. I joined the Army when I was 18. I was just a pimply-faced kid with nothing but little wisps of beard on my face and a desire to serve my country. He bounced a smile at the jurors, and they bounced nervous half smiles back at him. I was sent to the South Pacific. He leaned so far forward now he was teetering on the edge of his seat. I witnessed 11 nuclear explosions there, with no goggles or special clothing for protection, only instructions to turn away and cover my face. No one mentioned the danger of radioactivity. He waited a few seconds before continuing. It isn't that they didn't know. Scientists knew the risks from the earliest days of Los Alamos. They knew our military personnel got blistered and scarred after the bombings in Japan. They knew their hair fell out. They knew they had convulsions. They knew they had radiation poisoning, but they never told them. They never told us either. They wanted to see how we would react, what the blasts would do to us, whether our equipment would function. Norton's voice expanded and contracted, expanded again, and finally rose to a crescendo. We were their guinea pigs, nothing but guinea pigs. His voice shot up in the air, then fell to the floor. And then they dropped us like hot potatoes. His hands crashed down on the wooden railing in front of him. Silence descended. Observers in the courtroom shook their heads. The jurors looked stunned. Norton raised his hands, palms facing the jurors. It's not your fault you didn't know. It's been a very carefully kept secret. It's true. By telling you, I have just violated the Nuclear Radiation and Secrecy Agreements Act. I have just committed treason. I can cite the law for you if you'd like. His back stiffened and his chin jutted out. Well, today the gig is up. The words spilled from his mouth. The secrecy ends now, right here, right now. Light and shadow roiled in front of my eyes. This is Sylvia's voice. Like a burst blood vessel had just released dozens of competing thoughts and feelings in my head all at once. My chest swelled with pride and admiration for Norton's courage. It constricted with fear about what was going to happen to him. It shriveled with guilt for having doubted him. It made me want to protect him with my life. So that's a little sense of Norton and part of the story. There are two short excerpts from chapter 1 that I want to read in order to introduce you to Sylvia Jensen in 2019 and then to the plot in 2019. You may have heard it before, but it's short. This is the very beginning of chapter 1. It's Sylvia Jensen in 2019 from her point of view. Sylvia Jensen, long time no see. Martin Lind still looks like a stereotype, albeit an aging one. No matter the season, even like now in early summer, he wears the same brown sport coat with patches on the elbows, now frayed around the edges, the same threadbare British ivy hat that he's worn like a uniform for 50-some years of his life. I wave once, tuck a stray strand of gray hair into the bun at the back of my head, and scrunch down in the pew. It's not that I'm unhappy to see Martin. I like him a lot and have the utmost respect for him and what he's doing. I just want to make sure that seeing him, as well as other activists here, doesn't arouse in me a feeling that I should be doing more. Not that any of them can or want to make me feel that way. It's my issue, not theirs. One grounded in an old childhood sense of not being enough, that in the past pushed me to do too much and then left me feeling always like it still wasn't enough. I don't want to get sucked back into that pattern tonight. It's an old and deeply rooted character defect I've worked hard to overcome. And now that my life is better than ever, more serene and accepting, I intend to keep it that way. I should have done this. Bertha Pickering, 1920 to 2018, is projected in bold black letters on a giant screen at the front of the sanctuary. And there's a photo of Bertha, smiling under the weight of her signature hat, its floppy brim covered with dozens of what she called her kick-ass buttons. She was in her 90s when the picture was taken, but looks 10 years younger than I do now at 77. So that's Sylvia at the beginning, wanting to honor her heroine, Bertha Pickering, and also wanting to hang on to her serenity until 2 pages later, just a paragraph. A man in a nondescript tan button-down shirt and brown chinos passes by, leaving behind a trace of Aquavelva aftershave cologne that invades my nostrils and moves directly to my heart. The man heads down the middle aisle, turning his head from side to side in search of a place to sit. A full beard, dark brown, almost black. A ponytail halfway down his back. Green eyes. His green eyes. But of course it can't be him. Norton died more than 30 years ago. So who is this man who looks like him? Who has the same distinctive gait, the same slight backward sweep of his left leg, who wears the same cologne. He squeezes into a pew several rows in front of me, just as a ghost-like hush falls over the cavernous room. Hence comes Norton's son, Corey. So, introducing you to the key characters, Norton and Sylvia in 1982 or 84, and Corey and the trouble he gets into in 2019. I hope the plot is gripping and that the characters are relatable. But I also hope more than that, that this is more than a whodunit and that activists may find it useful to refer to their friends who may not want to read about the nuclear threat and what's going on, but might be willing to read what I hope be a good mystery. So this is, I'm going to turn us back on and end my slideshow, but did anyone want to say anything about what those people in Minnesota can do to take action, to call their representatives, to get the Minnesota, to get our Congress to sign on to the ban on nuclear weapons?
Dorothy, this is Lucia. It's just what you have said, to call Congress, call our representatives and ask them to press. Also, our senators, there are the names of the senators and our kind of our Twin Cities area representatives, to press them to get the Senate to ratify the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which has now been passed by the United Nations.
Yes, but the United States has not ratified it.
That's true. Now, if Marie were here, she could tell us how many nations around the world have ratified. Quite many, but none of the 9 nuclear nations has ratified the treaty. So it would be wonderful if the United States were to do that and to begin to disarm our weapons of nuclear destruction.
And the lobbying is fierce for our senators and congressmen not to vote to ratify. It is a fierce lobbying effort. And I want to put in a pitch for the Poor People's Campaign, because they take on militarism as one of the 5 evils, systemic poverty. And I remember when I first joined the beginning Wham, what drew me in was making the connection between the amount of money that was going to militarization, and especially nuclear weapons, and the cuts in human services. And it's the same issue today. And the Poor People's Campaign is a coalition of people who understand the connections of all those issues, that you can't solve one without solving all of them. Like, we cannot fully fund human needs unless we stop throwing our money at military. We can't solve the environmental crisis. So I'm going to get out of the slideshow now. I'm going to end it. And maybe we can come in a gallery view and see each other. And everybody seems to have taken themselves off of video. Here we come. There's not many of us here, but it's being live streamed. So Betty, do you have anything? I'd love to hear you say anything that comes to your mind about your experience with interviewing atomic veterans, what that was like, and what were your biggest learnings from that? And you're on mute,
there.
Yeah.
Gosh, well, thank you, Dorothy. And again, thank you for inviting me. It was just very powerful interviewing the veterans. I would like to say, by the way, that the way I got into it, into the study, at that time I was interested in understanding trauma better. And then one day there was a note in the department bulletin board. The daughter of a veteran was asking for anyone to come do some research. And so luckily she was connected to the veterans, the Massachusetts veterans group, the NAV, National Association of Atomic Veterans, Massachusetts chapter. I was at Boston University at the time. And so I interviewed 17. So takeaways, and I think you touched on it, they literally, one thing that stands out for me is how they were caught at a historical point where they chose to go into this. They saw themselves as volunteering, and the fact that World War II was seen as the good war. Mm-hmm. And so they were stuck to the last person saying, I would do it again, knowing what the consequences were of the exposure and how they were treated. And so I found, and so the meetings that they were having on a state level, I went to a Maine meeting, Massachusetts meetings. They were putting their story together for the very reason that you pointed out, Dorothy. They were bound to secrecy. And at least at one presentation, one veteran said, we're putting our own story together by hearing other stories so that they could integrate this experience into their own life, which I just found very painful to hear about. I mean, I would drive home from those interviews in tears. That was the other thing. They really hadn't allowed themselves, unlike the Vietnam veterans, to get angry and to say this was wrong. And so that stood out for me. One last story, I want to emphasize part of, so they were brought in to observe to see what the reactions were in the desert, Nevada test site. One story was that they were ordered to go in to the face of the blast and take their arms apart, take their rifles, and to see if they could put them together again in the midst of a blast. This is what the government wanted to see, how the military can function in the context of a blast. And so he said they were walking in towards the blast until they saw men in white suits waving them back. So it was, I also want to say, Dorothy has redeemed me because all I've done is an academic piece. And it was so important for me to get their stories out, to get the word out. And Dorothy's work has done that.
You know, some of their stories are in Nuclear Options. There's a group of atomic veterans, family members, that are desperate to stop what's going on, and they tell their stories on this island. And those are real stories about intergenerational physical cancers and things. But I'd also point out that when Betty was doing her research, they were still sworn to secrecy. So they were being very brave to form a federation of atomic veterans, because they were not freed of that law until 1996, when President Clinton, what do you call it? Got rid of it. And so then it was legal, but what they were doing when they talked to you was illegal.
Yeah.
Also, the thing that I want to add is that in writing this book, Betty's research was incredibly valuable, and the writing she did and some of the writing that Atomic Veterans did. And on my website, there's a 19-minute video of Atomic Veterans telling what it was like. It is extremely emotional. I mean, I almost want to put a trigger alert on the video before you watch it, but it's on the page called Featured, which features this particular book. And the other thing is, living in the Pacific Northwest now, I have learned that people in the Marshall Islands have been coming here to Seattle, that the United States had promised to care for them, of course, after, and this is also in the book, after saying that they were providing them with medical care, and then it was really just a placebo. They just wanted to see how they were going to react post being exposed to the atomic tests. But then they promised that they would provide assistance to the Marshall Islands, and they have reneged on that. The United States government feels that they have done their duty. So people are coming from the Marshall Islands to get medical care here in the United States in the Pacific Northwest, and students are coming to the University of Washington, and they have formed a group to tell their stories, and they have an annual commemoration of what has happened to the people of the Marshall Islands, and they become residents here. So there's just, I'm just so surprised by how many people were active in the 1980s who, like me, didn't hear anything about atomic veterans. And I did one of these book presentations for a group where a woman spoke up and said, my husband, before he died of cancer, told for the first time me that he was an atomic veteran, and told me what had happened. He had not even told her after like 50 years of marriage. And then somebody from the Seattle Times or something interviewed him, and it was in the paper. And the number of people who did not know, which of course makes sense if it's against the law to talk. So Betty's research led me to do much more than just tell a story about those of us in Wham who, were very active in all the things that we did. I mean, it just opened this whole Pandora's box.
Dorothy, I also want to mention, you reminded me, and I don't have explicit memories, but I recall, and this was 1985 when I graduated, so my work was in the early 80s. I believe there's atomic veteran groups in other countries, like England.
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't know if, there's been connections, so it's international.
Yeah, you can go to the website for the National Association of Atomic Veterans and, see what they're up to. And they have had to fight tooth and nail to get health benefits, to get coverage. They'd go to the doctor. This is in the book too. They'd go to the doctor and they'd have trouble. The doctor was having trouble diagnosing what was wrong because they were not allowed to tell them that they'd been exposed to radiation. And when they did tell them, there was nothing in their military record that corroborated that. So they're still fighting to get the benefits that they deserve. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on and on. There's 9 of us here now. This is good.
That is. And there may be some on Facebook and the other. Dorothy, I wanted to mention to you and to others that the WAMM's End War Committee has put out a new little postcard that it has just little short facts and quotes. And they're encouraging people to lobby not just our US senators and representatives, but also our city councils and state representatives.
Yeah.
So, wait a minute now, here. So why ban nuclear weapons?
Great.
And why act now? And it has such little, it lists the 9 countries that are armed with nuclear weapons. Did the kitty catch that? I don't know if you were able to read that, little kitty. But there are nearly 13,500 nuclear weapons in the world in the hands of 9 nations, and 90% of those are held by the US and Russia.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
that's us.
Yeah. And the scary thing today, of course, is the technology and how it can be hacked.
Those cards can be purchased through the Wham website, you can contact us and we can get those shipped to you, or you can pick them up in the office.
Yeah, if you want a big bunch, or you can just go into the office and get a little handful and get them to your city council members and other people around you.
I'd like to put in a pitch for helping to break out of silos, because in the 80s, I felt like I was pretty much in the peace group side, the peace silo, and didn't understand the connection between systemic racism and where are we putting the waste and who's exposed. Now it is in the book about how the uranium and the indigenous people on reservations and how exposed they are and how they're suffering today from higher rates of cancer because of being exposed. But to help people make those connections, that systemic racism, poverty, we have plenty of resources to meet the need. There should be nobody in this country without a roof over their heads. That's where we should be putting our money. And, when they talk about, we need this for GMD, ground missile defense system, nobody blinks an eye. Yeah, trillions of dollars, but you talk about housing for all, and it's like, oh, where are we going to get the money? Where are we going to get the money? So I think we need to really talk more about how we move the money from and how the peace movement and the environmentalists and the Black Lives Matter and the anti-racists and the anti-poverty groups are all in this together, which is why I've decided to join up and put my energy now into the Poor People's Campaign. So. Mm-hmm. Dr. Reverend Smith, you're on mute, but it's so good to see you in the mountains there.
Mute yourself. Oh, unmuted. Good.
All right. The mountains behind me are the West Bank between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea.
Oh my goodness.
It's desert, as you can see, and it's going downhill. Jerusalem is a half mile above sea level, 10 miles to the east. The Dead Sea is a half a mile below sea level, a quarter mile below. So you go down 3/4 of a mile in 10 miles distance.
And you're there now, right?
Well, that's a picture I took when I was there.
All right.
And I was also reminded that one of these think tanks was trying to talk about the best way to invest a lot of money to solve the problem, was suggesting that they move Palestinians farther east in the West Bank and build a high-speed rail line, which would run from left to right across that picture. Now, if you can see the picture closely, you'd see that nobody in their right mind would imagine putting something from left to right across that territory. Or moving Palestinians to the east means moving them deeper into the desert.
I really I feel nostalgic, Father Smith. I wish we were teaching a course now. Boy, the connections we could make now with what's going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and how how that's all connected with what's happening here with systemic racism, with the Palestinian boys being killed by Israeli forces, and boy, what we could do with a class of young 20-year-olds or younger at this point.
Well, I'm not in full-time teaching anymore. I am working with Twin Cities Nonviolent, group headed by Father Harry Bury. Also working with Iraqi American Reconciliation Project.
Great.
And with Minnesota BDS, who Break the Bond, trying to promote boycott, divestment, sanctions.
Wonderful. I hope you check out the Poor People's Campaign too.
Yes. I heard the words go by. Probably you hear all these things, they all tumble over each other.
We're always looking for faith leaders to be a part of that campaign.
Yeah. Poor People's Campaign. I'll write it down.
Any other thoughts? Or Carol, thank you for writing an endorsement for the book. I really appreciated that.
You're quite welcome. Really enjoyed it.
What
I
are you?
might-
Oh, go ahead.
I might mention that the course you and I took, Dorothy, as you know, was the first course at St. Thomas,
That's right.
Justice and Peace, as we were just developing the program.
Yes,
It's still strong and running now.
that's great.
Like
That's great.
20, 30 majors,
Wonderful.
10, 15 majors if you graduate a year.
And for people who may not know, Father Smith would have Marv Davidoff co-teach with him and come into his classroom and talk with the students. So Marv Davidoff, also known as Martin Lynn.
Yes. Right.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming. No need to hang on any longer than we need to, but I hope, David, you saw the slideshow this time.
I did see the slideshow, but there was a white thing in front of it that said this meeting is being recorded. And I clicked on got it and it will disappear. So I clicked on got it and it did not disappear. So about the right third of the show was covered, partly covered. But that's
Oh, my goodness.